The 1988 disappearance of Elara Shaw was a tragedy that faded into a 14-year-old cold case. The first break came not from a tip, but from an FBI raid on a reclusive millionaire for massive financial fraud. While inventorying the sprawling property, agents discovered a hidden passageway behind a library bookshelf. It led to a subterranean wine cellar, and what they found inside revealed Elara's case was connected to something far more sinister than a random abduction. The scent of pulverized plaster and century-old dust was Kaylin Shaw's immediate world. Suspended 40 feet above the marble floor of the Luzerne County Courthouse rotunda, the harness pinched at his thighs. He was balanced precariously on the scaffolding, a fine bristled brush in hand, meticulously retouching the faded cerulean robe of a neoclassical figure representing justice. It was October 2002, and Kaylin, at 28, found a strange comfort in restoration, bringing clarity back to what time had obscured. The work was slow, deliberate, a counterpoint to the restless energy that always hummed beneath his surface, the legacy of a childhood shattered by absence. He focused on the delicate curve of a painted eyelid, the brushstrokes barely visible, the pigment blending seamlessly with the aged plaster. Below him, the daily business of the courthouse was a muted murmur, the echoes of footsteps and hushed conversations rising to the dome like whispers from the past. He was lost in the work, the silence of the dome amplifying the sound of his own breathing, when a sharp whistle cut through the quiet hum. Kaylin looked down, squinting against the glare of the floor lights. His supervisor, Barry Eklund, was waving frantically, pointing toward the ground-level office set up in a corner of the rotunda. "Shaw! Phone! It's your mother!" Barry shouted, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "She says it's an emergency." A jolt of adrenaline, cold and unwelcome, shot through Kaylin. His parents never called him at work. They respected the delicate nature of his job, the necessity of his focus. They hadn't called him at work since 1988. He clipped his tools to his belt, the specialized chisels and brushes heavy against his thighs, and began the slow descent, the motorized winch whining in the vast space. Every foot he dropped seemed to tighten the knot forming in his stomach. The descent felt agonizingly slow, the marble floor rising to meet him with a terrifying inevitability. He unclipped the harness, his legs stiff as he hit the ground, the sudden return to gravity disorienting. He jogged to the temporary site office, a plywood cubicle cluttered with blueprints and solvent cans. He grabbed the receiver, the plastic slick in his sweaty hand. "Mom? What's wrong? Is Dad okay?" His mother's voice was fractured, a thin, reedy sound Kaylin hadn't heard since the weeks following the disappearance, the weeks when the silence had stretched into months, then years. "Kaylin, they found something. The police. They need you to come home." "Found what?" "Mom, you're scaring me." "It's about Elara." The name hit Kaylin like a physical blow. Elara, his sister. 15 years old in 1988, vanished on a rural road while riding her bicycle to school. 14 years of silence, of cold trails and dead ends, of a grief that had never scarred over but remained a raw, open wound throbbing beneath the surface of their lives. "What did they find?" Kaylin asked, his voice barely a whisper, the courthouse sounds fading into the background, the world narrowing to the sound of his mother's labored breathing. She explained in disjointed fragments, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear and desperate hope. Federal agents had raided a large, historic estate in their home county, Blackwood Manor. The owner, a man named Byron Jennings, had been arrested for massive financial fraud. The raid had nothing to do with Elara, not initially. But during the exhaustive inventory of the sprawling property, they had discovered something hidden, something that required the family to confirm a serial number. Kaylin closed his eyes, the bustling courthouse fading away. He saw Elara as she was that morning, captured in the photograph his mother kept on the mantelpiece. Blonde hair pulled back, smiling, wearing her school uniform, a navy jacket over a white collared shirt, a blue skirt with white polka dots. And the bicycle, White, classic style, with gleaming silver handlebars. The image was seared into his memory, a snapshot of a life interrupted. "Mom, where's the old report? The one with the bike details?" He heard the rustling of papers, his mother's voice trembling as she searched for the document she had kept for 14 years, a talisman against the void. She read the serial number aloud, the digits echoing in the quiet space of the phone line. Kalen repeated it back to her, each digit etched into his memory, a sequence he had traced countless times in his mind. A moment later, a new voice came on the line, gruff, professional, but laced with a weary sympathy. "Mr. Shaw? This is Detective Miles Hanlon, Pennsylvania State Police. I understand your mother gave you the serial number from the original report." "Yes," Kalen said, gripping the phone tighter, the plastic creaking under the pressure. "We have a positive match, Mr. Shaw. We found your sister's bicycle." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. A match. After 14 years, the first tangible piece of Alara's disappearance had surfaced in a place none of them had ever heard of. The silence that had defined their lives was finally broken. Kalen told Barry he had a family emergency and left the courthouse, the restoration project unfinished, the figure of justice left suspended in the dome, her eyes blank, her scales unbalanced. The drive back to his hometown was a blur of autumn foliage and winding country roads. The familiar landscape, usually a source of comfort, now felt ominous, the vibrant colors of the leaves seeming unnaturally bright, almost menacing. Every curve in the road, every dense patch of woods seemed to hold the echo of Alara's last ride, the ghost of a girl on a white bicycle vanishing into the silence. When he arrived at his parents' house, the atmosphere was thick with a resurrected trauma. The house felt smaller, darker, the walls pressing in on them. His parents, aged prematurely by years of uncertainty, were overwhelmed, the sudden resurgence of hope colliding with the paralyzing fear of what this discovery might mean. They looked fragile, broken, the carefully constructed facade of normalcy crumbling around them. "We can't do this again, Kalen," his father said, his voice trembling, his eyes fixed on the fireplace, as if searching for answers in the cold ashes. "The interviews, the speculation. It nearly destroyed us the first time." "I know, Dad." "I'll handle it," Kalen promised, the weight of their expectation settling onto his shoulders. "I'll talk to the police. I'll find out what they know." His parents entrusted him with the burden they could no longer carry. Kalen called Detective Hanlon and arranged to meet him at Blackwood Manor the following morning. He spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, the image of a white bicycle superimposed on the darkness, a ghost emerging from the wreckage of the past, the silence of the night screaming with unanswered questions. Blackwood Manor loomed at the end of a long tree-lined driveway, a monument to old money and secluded privilege. The estate was sprawling, a Gothic revival masterpiece of dark stone and leaded glass windows, surrounded by acres of manicured lawns and dense woodland. As Kalen pulled up, the idyllic scene was shattered by the presence of government vehicles, sedans, vans, and a large mobile command center parked near the entrance. Federal agents moved with brisk efficiency across the property, their focus clearly on the financial crimes that had brought them here. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering, a testament to the power and influence of the man who owned this place. Kalen parked his truck near the command center, the gravel crunching under his tires. He spotted Detective Hanlon waiting by the main entrance, a solitary figure in a rumpled suit amidst the sea of FBI windbreakers. Hanlon was in his 50s, with a weathered face and tired eyes that suggested he had seen too much over the years. He greeted Kalen with a solemn nod, his expression grim. "Mr. Shaw, thank you for coming," Hanlon said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy surrounding them. "I need to prepare you. This isn't easy." "Just show me," Kalen replied, his voice tight with anticipation. He had spent the night imagining what they had found, the scenarios playing out in his mind in an endless loop of horror and dread. He needed to see it, to make it real. Hanlon led him through the opulent main house. The interior was a testament to excess, crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceilings like glittering icicles, antique furniture polished to a high sheen, priceless art adorning the walls. But the atmosphere was clinical, disturbed. Agents were meticulously cataloging every item, tagging evidence, treating the manor like a crime scene. The wealth on display felt obscene, a grotesque backdrop to the tragedy that had unfolded here. Kalen felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. What kind of place was this? They stopped in the library, a vast room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. The air was thick with the smell of aging paper and expensive tobacco. Hanlon walked to a section near the fireplace, a massive structure of carved mahogany, and pressed a hidden mechanism. A section of the bookshelf swung open with a heavy groan, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. The air that wafted up from the opening was cold and damp, carrying the scent of mildew, dust, and something else, something metallic, unsettling. "This wasn't on the original blueprints," Hanlon explained, his voice hushed. "The agents found it during the secondary sweep. It seems to be part of an older structure beneath the main house." They descended a steep flight of stone stairs, the steps worn smooth by time. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, the sounds of the manor above fading away. The passage opened into a subterranean complex. Kalen's breath caught in his throat. It was a wine cellar, but unlike any he had ever seen. The walls and arched ceiling were made of rough, uneven stone, giving the room an ancient, dungeon-like quality. The lighting was dim and artificial, the forensic floodlights casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the racks of countless dusty bottles, stretching from floor to ceiling. The air was thick with dust, the motes swirling in the beams of light. But it wasn't the wine that drew Kalen's attention. It was the scene in the center of the room that stopped him cold, the blood draining from his face. On a dark red, almost burgundy-colored mat stood a strange wooden apparatus. It consisted of a base with 3 or 4 legs supporting a sharp pyramid-shaped wooden point at the top. It looked ancient, medieval, brutal in its simplicity. Hanging directly above this pyramid from the stone ceiling was a system of ropes and what looked like a harness, all appearing old and weathered. The ropes were a light, dusty color, contrasting with the dark wood of the device below. The sight was visceral, sickening. Kalen didn't know what it was, but its purpose was brutally clear. It was designed for pain, for slow, agonizing torment. "What is that?" Kalen asked, his voice trembling, the words barely audible. Hanlon's expression was grim, his eyes fixed on the apparatus. "It's called a Judas cradle, a historical torture device, used for prolonged stress positions, designed to break the will." Kalen felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The image of Alara in this place, confronted with this monstrosity, was unbearable. He turned away, trying to regain his composure, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the cold stone wall. And that's when he saw it. Mounted high on the wall like a grotesque trophy was a bicycle. It was white, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, causing it to blend into the pale, grimy stone wall. But the shape was unmistakable. The classic frame, the silver handlebars. It was Alara's bike. The placement felt deliberate, a cruel mockery, the symbol of her freedom, her independence, now hanging in this dark underground chamber of horrors. Kalen stumbled back, the reality of the discovery crashing down on him, the weight of 14 years of uncertainty compressed into this single, horrifying image. "Why?" he choked out, the single word encompassing all the horror and confusion of the past. "Why is it here?" "We don't know," Hanlon admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But we're going to find out." The silence in the cellar was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of agents moving overhead. Kalen stared at the bicycle, the physical manifestation of his worst fears. Ilara hadn't just vanished. Something terrible had happened to her, and it had happened here. The nightmare had a location, a shape, a name. Blackwood Manor. The discovery in the cellar shifted the atmosphere at Blackwood Manor from a white-collar crime scene to something far darker. The sterile efficiency of the federal investigation was now tainted by the shadow of a long-dormant horror. Kalen, fueled by a desperate need for answers, confronted Hanlon and the lead FBI agent, a sharp-suited man named Agent Reynolds, in the Manor's grand ballroom, now converted into a makeshift command center. "You found her bike in a torture chamber," Kalen insisted, his voice raw with emotion, the words echoing strangely in the vast, opulent room. "This has to be your priority now. You have to find out what happened to her." Agent Reynolds regarded him with a cool, detached sympathy. He was a man accustomed to dealing with numbers, with spreadsheets, with the abstract crimes of the wealthy. The raw, messy reality of a potential homicide was clearly outside his comfort zone. "Mr. Shaw, we understand your distress," Reynolds began, his tone measured, bureaucratic. "But our mandate here is the financial fraud case against Byron Jennings. The scope of this investigation is massive, involving international transactions, shell corporations, hundreds of millions of dollars. We cannot divert resources based on a cold case discovery, however disturbing." "A cold case? This is evidence," Kalen protested, his voice rising in disbelief. "This is the first break we've had in 14 years. You can't just ignore it." Hanlon stepped in, trying to mediate, his expression pained. He understood Kalen's frustration, but he also understood the realities of the system. "Kalen, there's something else you need to know." The initial forensic sweep of the cellar. It was disappointing. Kalen stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "You found the bike. You found that thing." "The cellar is thick with dust," Hanlon explained, his frustration evident in the tightness of his jaw. "It suggests years of disuse. The air quality is poor, the conditions less than ideal for preserving evidence. And surprisingly, we found no DNA, no blood, no physical trace of Ilara. Nothing to definitively place her in that room." The news hit Kalen like a punch to the gut. Without physical proof, Ilara's case was in danger of being sidelined again. The bureaucracy of the investigation, the competing priorities, the lack of forensic evidence. It all felt like a wall closing in, threatening to bury Ilara's story once more. The hope that had flickered briefly upon the discovery of the bike was rapidly extinguishing, replaced by a familiar, agonizing sense of helplessness. "So that's it?" Kalen asked, his voice laced with bitterness. "You find her bike, and then you just walk away? You let them get away with it?" "We're not walking away," Hanlon insisted, his voice firm. "But we need more. We need a connection between Ilara and this place, something beyond the bicycle, something tangible." Kalen left the manor feeling hollowed out, the initial surge of adrenaline replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. He knew instinctively that if he didn't act, the case would go cold again. The answers were here, buried somewhere in the history of Blackwood Manor, and he was the only one who seemed determined to dig them up. Miles Hanlon watched Kalen leave, sharing his frustration but bound by the constraints of procedure. He knew Kalen was right. The key lay in the cellar, but he needed leverage. He turned his attention to the man who held the keys to Blackwood Manor. Byron Jennings was being held in federal custody, awaiting arraignment on the fraud charges. Hanlon arranged an interview, hoping to exploit Jennings's precarious situation to find a crack in the facade of his arrogance. Jennings was in his 60s, impeccably dressed even in the sterile environment of the interrogation room. He regarded Hanlon with an air of amused arrogance, seemingly unconcerned by the gravity of the situation. He was a man accustomed to control, to manipulating the system to his advantage. "Detective Hanlon," Jennings greeted him, leaning back in his chair, his posture relaxed, confident. To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to offer me a deal on my extensive wine collection? I understand it's been seized as evidence. I'm here to talk about the hidden cellar beneath your house, Hanlon said, cutting straight to the point, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. And the items we found inside. Jennings waved a dismissive hand, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. Ah, yes, the historical replicas. Fascinating, aren't they? A testament to the morbid curiosity of the past. Replicas? Hanlon challenged, skepticism dripping from his voice. Including the white bicycle mounted on the wall? Especially the bicycle, Jennings replied smoothly, his eyes meeting Hanlon's gaze directly. A piece of conceptual art, I believe, a commentary on the loss of innocence, perhaps, left by the previous owners when I purchased the estate in 1995. I rarely used the cellar, detective. Too damp. It ruined a few cases of very expensive Bordeaux. The bicycle belonged to Elara Shaw, a girl who vanished in 1988, Hanlon pressed, watching Jennings closely for any sign of recognition, any flicker of guilt. Jennings showed nothing. His expression remained impassive, bored. Tragic, I'm sure, but it has nothing to do with me. I acquired the property 7 years after her disappearance. I am a businessman, detective, not a monster. Jennings lawyered up shortly after, blocking any further inquiry. The interview was over. Hanlon left the interrogation room feeling stonewalled. Jennings was lying, he was sure of it, but proving it was another matter. The lack of physical evidence in the cellar was a massive hurdle. If Jennings wasn't the culprit, then the answers lay in the estate's prior ownership. He needed to find out who owned Blackwood Manor in 1988, and he needed proof that Elara had been there. The bureaucratic wall was high, impenetrable. He needed a way over it, or through it. The image of the dusty bicycle haunted Kalin. It wasn't just the sight of it, hanging there like a grotesque trophy. It was the silence surrounding it, the agonizing lack of answers. He couldn't accept the forensic team's conclusion. They were wrong. Elara had been in that cellar. He felt it in his bones, a visceral certainty that defied logic and evidence. He needed proof, not for the police, not for the bureaucracy, but for himself. He needed to touch something that belonged to her, something that confirmed her presence in that horrific place. Driven by a restless agitation, a desperate need for connection, Kalin found himself driving back to Blackwood Manor late that night. The government vehicles were still there, the command center humming with activity, the floodlights illuminating the facade of the manor. But the perimeter security seemed focused on the main house, where the financial documents were stored. The grounds, vast and sprawling, were shrouded in darkness. He parked his truck down the road, hidden in a dense thicket of trees, and approached the estate on foot, slipping past the perimeter security tape, the silence of the night amplifying the sound of his own breathing. He knew it was reckless, illegal, but the thought of Elara's presence being dismissed, erased, was unbearable. He had to find something, anything, that connected her to that place. He found an exterior cellar door hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown ivy, the heavy wooden planks warped and rotting. It was locked, but Kalin's expertise in historical restoration had equipped him with a specialized set of tools and a working knowledge of old locking mechanisms. He made quick work of the lock, the metal screeching softly in the quiet night. He slipped inside, the heavy wooden door closing behind him with a muffled thud. He descended back into the cellar, the darkness enveloping him. The air was cold and still, the silence absolute. He switched on his high-powered flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The Judas cradle stood in the center of the room, a silent sentinel. Kalin avoided looking at it, the sight too painful, the implications too horrifying. He focused on the wall where the bicycle was mounted, the white frame ghostly in the beam of his flashlight. He approached the wall, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't a detective. He didn't know how to look for clues, for fingerprints, for DNA. But he knew structures. He knew how buildings aged, how they settled, how they revealed their secrets to those who knew how to read them. He knew the language of stone and mortar, the subtle variations in texture and color that spoke of repairs, of modifications, of hidden histories. He examined the masonry around the mounting brackets, his trained eye searching for any anomaly, any inconsistency. The stone was ancient, the mortar crumbling in places. But around the brackets, something was different. The mortar was subtly newer, a slightly different shade of gray, and applied less expertly than the surrounding ancient stone. It was a small detail, a minor flaw, easily missed by a cursory forensic sweep focused on biological evidence. But to Kalin, it screamed. The bicycle hadn't been mounted when the cellar was built. It had been added later, and the wall had been repaired, modified. As he probed the area, tracing the lines of the newer mortar with his fingertips, he heard a noise from above. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Agents moving on the floor directly above him. Panic seized him. He switched off his flashlight, plunging the cellar into darkness. He had to move quickly. He pulled a specialized chisel from his kit, the thin, strong blade designed for delicate work. He inserted the tip into a loose section of the mortar near the bike mount and began to pry, quietly, carefully, the sound of the metal scraping against the stone agonizingly loud in the silence. The mortar gave way, revealing a loose stone. He pulled the stone free, the weight heavy in his hand, creating a small, dark recess in the wall. He shone his flashlight inside, the beam illuminating the cramped space. Something glinted in the darkness. He reached inside, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. He pulled it out, his hand trembling. It was a locket, tarnished silver, intricately engraved. He recognized it immediately. Ilara wore it constantly. It was a gift from him, bought with the money he had saved from his first summer job. He had given it to her on her 15th birthday, just weeks before she vanished. He opened the clasp, the tiny hinge protesting softly. Inside were 2 small photographs, faded with time. His face, her face, smiling, innocent. His breath caught in his throat. The forensic sweep had missed it, hidden behind the stone, shielded from the dust and decay of the cellar. Proof. Ilara had been here. He pocketed the locket, the cold metal heavy against his skin. He quickly replaced the stone, pressing the loose mortar back into place, obscuring the recess. He heard the sound of the library bookshelf opening above him, the heavy groan of the mechanism echoing down the stairs. Someone was coming down. He moved quickly towards the exterior cellar door, guided by memory and instinct. He slipped outside just as the cellar door at the top of the stairs opened, spilling light into the darkness. He closed the exterior door behind him, the click of the lock swallowed by the night. He ran back to his truck, his heart pounding in his chest, the locket clutched tightly in his hand. The cold night air burned his lungs, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He had the proof. Now he needed to understand why. Kalin drove straight to his parents' house. It was past midnight, but he knew they wouldn't be asleep. They rarely slept through the night, the silence of the darkness amplifying the echoes of the past. He found them sitting in the living room, the television murmuring unwatched in the corner, the space between them heavy with the weight of 14 years of uncertainty. He walked in and placed the locket on the coffee table. The tarnished silver seemed to absorb the dim light of the room. His mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She picked up the locket, her fingers tracing the familiar engraving, the delicate pattern of ivy leaves. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes, her voice thick with emotion. "In the cellar." "Hidden in the wall," Kalin explained, his voice raw, the exhaustion catching up with him. His father took the locket from his mother, examining it closely. He opened the clasp, looking at the tiny photographs inside. A wave of grief washed over his face, the lines around his eyes deepening, followed by a flicker of something else. Resolve. A hardening of the features, a tightening of the jaw. "She was there," his father said, the words heavy with finality. The locket was the confirmation they needed. It was the first tangible proof that Ilara had physically been inside that cellar. The agonizing uncertainty of the past 14 years began to crystallize into a painful reality. They were no longer searching for a ghost. They were investigating a crime scene. The next morning, Kalin took the locket to Detective Hanlon. He found Hanlon at the State Police Barracks, drowning in paperwork, the office cluttered with files and empty coffee cups. "I found this," Kalin said, placing the locket on Hanlon's desk, the small metallic object seeming impossibly heavy. Hanlon picked it up, examining it closely. "Where?" "In the cellar." "At Blackwood Manor." Hanlon's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "You went back there?" "Kalin, that's a federal crime scene. You could be arrested. You could have compromised the entire investigation." "I had to," Kalin insisted, meeting Hanlon's gaze directly. "I knew there was something more. I knew she was there." Hanlon sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was furious at Kalin's interference, the potential contamination of the crime scene. But he also recognized the significance of the find. The locket was a game-changer. "It was hidden in the wall behind a loose stone," Kalin explained. "The forensics team missed it. They were looking for DNA, for blood. They weren't looking for this." Hanlon examined the locket again. It provided the necessary physical link to Alara, the leverage he needed to intensify the investigation into the historical context of the estate. He could now push back against the FBI's prioritization of the fraud case. "Okay," Hanlon said, his tone shifting from frustration to determination. "This changes things. We can use this." While Hanlon mobilized his team to conduct a more thorough search of the cellar, Kalin turned his attention to the history of Blackwood Manor. If Byron Jennings wasn't involved, then the answers lay with the previous owners. He went to the county records office, the air thick with the smell of aging paper and dust. He started digging through the property records, the heavy ledgers filled with handwritten entries, tracing the ownership of Blackwood Manor back through the decades. He found it. From 1985 to 1995, including 1988, the estate was owned not by an individual but by an organization, the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society. The name sounded innocuous, harmless, a group of history buffs, perhaps, dedicated to preserving the past. But Kalin felt a growing sense of unease. Why would a preservation society need a hidden torture chamber? He visited the local historical society, hoping to find more information about the Brandywine group. The archivist, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, recognized the name immediately. She was a small, bird-like woman, surrounded by towering stacks of books and documents. "Oh, yes, the Brandywine Society," she said, her tone laced with disapproval, a subtle shift in her demeanor, suggesting a long-held distaste for the organization. "They were quite active in the 80s and 90s, very elite, very secretive. They didn't associate with us, the local historians. They considered themselves above us." "What can you tell me about them?" Kalin asked, trying to keep his voice casual, masking the urgency churning in his gut. "They were obsessed with historical accuracy," Mrs. Gable explained, adjusting her glasses, the lenses magnifying her sharp, intelligent eyes. But their methods were unconventional. They focused heavily on the more austere aspects of colonial history: discipline, punishment, moral rectitude. They held these elaborate historical reenactments at Blackwood Manor, very exclusive affairs. She paused, her expression darkening. "They disbanded abruptly in 1995, sold Blackwood Manor, and vanished. No explanation, no forwarding address. It was all very strange." Kalin pressed her for more details. Mrs. Gable provided him with a collection of old newspaper clippings and event programs related to the society. He sat at a microfilm reader, the machine whirring softly as he scrolled through the archives. The rhetoric in the articles and programs was unsettling. They spoke of the perceived moral decay of modern times, the need for a return to historical values, the importance of preserving the foundational principles of the nation. He compiled a list of the board members, the names reading like a who's who of the local elite: businessmen, academics, politicians. But it was the underlying message that chilled him: an obsession with control, with correction, disguised as historical preservation. He returned to Hanlon with the information, the stack of photocopies heavy in his hand. The connection was terrifying. Elara had vanished during the time the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society owned Blackwood Manor, and now her locket had been found in their hidden torture chamber. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a horrifying picture. The abstract evil that had haunted his family for 14 years was beginning to take shape, to have a name: the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society. The discovery of the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society shifted the focus of the investigation. The abstract horror of the cellar began to coalesce into something tangible, something human. Kalin now had a list of names, a potential motive rooted in the Society's obsession with historical discipline. But he still didn't understand why Elara had been targeted. What had a 15-year-old girl done to attract the attention of this extremist group? He sat in his motel room, the photograph of Elara propped up on the bedside table. The image of her smiling, vibrant, full of life, contrasted sharply with the dark reality of the cellar. Her blonde hair pulled back, the bright orange straps of her backpack a splash of color against the navy blue of her jacket. She looked so innocent, so unprepared for the darkness that awaited her. Why her? He needed to understand Elara's life in 1988, the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The initial police investigation had focused on the possibility of a stranger abduction, a random act of violence. They had interviewed friends, teachers, neighbors, searching for any anomaly, any deviation from the norm. But they had found nothing. Elara's life had seemed utterly ordinary. But this felt different. This felt personal. He started tracking down Elara's old friends. It was a difficult task 14 years later. Most had moved away, their lives carrying them far from the shadow of the past. He spent days making phone calls, chasing down leads, navigating the fragmented landscape of memory. But he found one who remained. Mariah Vance, Elara's best friend from high school, now living 2 towns over, her life defined by the ordinary rhythms of marriage and motherhood. He called her, the conversation awkward and strained. Mariah was hesitant to dredge up the past, the wounds still raw after all these years. The disappearance of Elara Shaw was a local tragedy, a cautionary tale whispered among the residents of the county. But when Kalin mentioned the discovery at Blackwood Manor, the reopening of the investigation, the possibility of answers, she agreed to meet him. They met at a small diner, the air thick with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The booth they sat in was cramped, the vinyl seats cracked and worn. Mariah looked tired, older than her years. She clutched her coffee mug tightly, her knuckles white, her eyes darting nervously around the diner as if afraid of being overheard. "I still dream about her," Mariah admitted, her voice barely a whisper, the confession hanging in the air between them. "I still expect to see her riding up on that white bicycle, her hair flying behind her." "Tell me about her," Kalin urged gently, his voice low, intimate. "Tell me about 1988. Anything you remember? Anything that seemed strange, unusual?" Mariah described Elara as outspoken, intelligent, fiercely independent. A girl who challenged authority, who refused to accept the status quo. She was passionate about justice, about fairness, about the world around her. "She wasn't afraid of anyone," Mariah said, a faint smile touching her lips, the memory of her friend's defiance, a source of both pride and pain. "She always stood up for what she believed in. She hated hypocrisy, injustice." "Did she have any enemies?" Kalin asked, the question feeling crass, reductive in the face of Mariah's grief. "Anyone who might have wanted to hurt her?" Mariah hesitated, swirling the coffee in her mug, the dark liquid reflecting the fluorescent lights of the diner. "No, not enemies. Elara was loved. She was popular. But there was an incident shortly before she disappeared. It didn't seem important at the time, but now I wonder. Kalen leaned forward, his heart pounding, the anticipation tightening his chest. What incident? It was in history class, Mariah recounted, her voice trembling slightly, the memory still vivid, unsettling. We had a substitute teacher. He was older, intense, obsessed with discipline, historical punishments. He was talking about the Salem witch trials, justifying the methods used to extract confessions. He said they were necessary to maintain order, to purify the community. Kalen felt a chill run down his spine. The rhetoric was eerily familiar, echoing the language of the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society. And Alara challenged him? Kalen asked, knowing the answer before Mariah spoke. She eviscerated him, Mariah said, her eyes flashing with the memory, a flicker of the defiant girl she once was. She called his views barbaric, archaic. She quoted historical texts, legal precedents. She dismantled his arguments, point by point. She embarrassed him in front of the entire class. He was furious. The memory seemed to crystallize in Mariah's mind, the details sharpening, the emotions resurfacing. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. It was worse. It was a cold, controlled anger. He looked at her with such contempt, such hatred. He told her she needed to be corrected, that her modern defiance would be her undoing. The word corrected. It hung in the air between them, heavy and ominous. The doctrine of the Brandywine Society, the purpose of the Judas Cradle. "Do you remember his name?" Kalen asked, his voice urgent, desperate. Mariah shook her head, the frustration evident in her expression. "No, it was so long ago. He was only there for a few weeks, but I remember his face, severe, intellectual, and his eyes, cold, judgmental, like he was looking down on us from some great height." Kalen left the diner with a renewed sense of purpose. The connection was tenuous, circumstantial, but it was the first lead they had that explained why Alara might have been targeted. A defiant girl, a zealous teacher, and a secret society obsessed with correction. The pieces were falling into place. He needed to identify that substitute teacher. He needed to connect him to the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society. The echoes of 1988 were growing louder, clearer, leading him toward the truth. Kalen drove straight to Alara's old high school. The building hadn't changed much in 14 years. The same brick facade, the same echoing hallways, the same pervasive smell of floor wax and teenage anxiety. But the atmosphere felt different, heavier, the innocence of the place tainted by the shadow of the past. He went to the administration office, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and photocopier toner. He asked to see the substitute teacher records from 1988. The request was met with suspicion, resistance. The school secretary, a brisk woman with tightly permed hair and a name tag that read Brenda, regarded him with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Those records are confidential," she said, her voice clipped, dismissive. "We can't release them without a court order, and besides, they are archived. It would take weeks to retrieve them." Kalen leaned closer, his voice low and steady, the underlying anger simmering beneath the surface. "My sister, Alara Shaw, was a student here in 1988. The police have reopened the investigation into her disappearance. I believe a substitute teacher who worked here during that time may be involved. I need those records. Now." The secretary hesitated, recognizing the name. The disappearance of Alara Shaw was a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the hallways, a ghost that haunted the collective memory of the school. "I need those records," Kalen insisted, leveraging the weight of the reopened investigation, the implied threat of obstruction of justice. "If you don't provide them, the police will be back with a warrant. And I assure you, that will be far more disruptive to your day." The secretary, intimidated by the prospect of a police investigation disrupting the school's routine, the potential negative publicity, reluctantly agreed. She disappeared into the archives, a dusty storage room filled with filing cabinets and discarded textbooks. She returned an hour later, her hair slightly askew, a smudge of dust on her cheek, carrying a heavy binder. Kalen opened the binder, his hands trembling slightly. He scanned the pages, the handwritten entries blurring together, the names meaningless, forgotten. And then he found it. September 1988. History class. The substitute teacher, Mr. Alistair Finch. The name felt familiar, vaguely recognizable, but he couldn't place it. It was an ordinary name, unremarkable, but it held the key to the mystery of Alara's disappearance. He thanked the secretary, his voice tight with anticipation, and left the school, the name echoing in his mind. Alistair Finch. He returned to the local historical society, the list of the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society board members clutched in his hand. He found the archivist, Mrs. Gable, organizing a stack of old photographs, the black and white images capturing moments of the town's history. "Mrs. Gable, do you recognize the name Alistair Finch?" Kalen asked, his voice casual, masking the urgency churning in his gut. "Of course," she replied without hesitation, her sharp eyes meeting his. "He was the chief historian for the Brandywine Society. A brilliant man, an expert on colonial history, but deeply unsettling. There was a coldness about him, an arrogance." Kalen felt a jolt of adrenaline. He cross-referenced the name with the list of board members. There it was. Alistair Finch, senior board member, the inner circle. The connection was undeniable. The substitute teacher who had threatened Alara, who had called her defiant, who had spoken of the need for correction, was a high-ranking member of the organization that owned the property where her bike and locket were found in a torture chamber. The motive was clear, the opportunity present, the connection established. He continued scanning the list of board members, searching for other connections, for other names that resonated with the power and influence Mrs. Gable had described. And then he saw a name that stopped him cold, the blood draining from his face. Chairman of the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society, Roman Thorne. Kalen was stunned. He leaned against the table, the room spinning slightly. Roman Thorne was a highly respected sitting judge known for his powerful connections, his austere reputation, his iron grip on the local legal system. He was the embodiment of the law, the guardian of justice. The gravity of the situation hit him with full force. This wasn't just a fringe group of historical extremists. This was a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. They were protected, insulated by Thorne's influence, by the very system designed to uphold the law. He went straight to Detective Hanlon, the information burning in his mind. He laid out the connections, Alara's confrontation with Finch, Finch's role in the society, Thorne's leadership. He spread the documents on Hanlon's desk, the evidence undeniable, terrifying. Hanlon listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grim. He recognized the immense difficulty of the situation. Investigating a sitting judge required irrefutable proof, a mountain of evidence that they simply didn't have yet. "This is dangerous territory, Kalen," Hanlon warned, his voice low, the concern in his eyes genuine. "These are powerful men. They won't go down easily. They will fight back with everything they have." "I know," Kalen replied, his resolve hardening, the fear replaced by a cold, focused anger. But they made a mistake. They kept the evidence. The realization hung in the air between them. The bike, the locket, the cellar. They were tangible links to the past, cracks in the facade of the conspiracy. And Kalen was determined to exploit them, to break the wall of silence that had protected Alara's tormentors for 14 years. The path forward was perilous, uncertain, but for the first time they had a direction. They knew who they were hunting. And the hunt was leading them straight to the heart of power. Kalen understood that to confront Thorne and Finch, he needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed to understand their ideology, the twisted logic that drove them to commit such atrocities. He needed to anticipate their actions, to predict how they would react to the exposure of their secrets. He needed to delve into the darkness that had consumed his sister. He visited a university library specializing in historical archives, a place where the past was preserved in climate-controlled rooms and endless rows of shelves. The public records had provided the names, the structure of the organization. But he needed to delve deeper into the private writings, the internal communications that revealed their true nature. He needed to understand the doctrine that fueled their actions. He found a collection of privately printed newsletters and pamphlets from the Society, donated by a former member who had apparently experienced a crisis of conscience, or perhaps simply sought to unburden themselves of the weight of the past. They were filed away in a remote corner of the archives, forgotten and undisturbed for years, the fragile paper yellowed with age. He sat at a reading table, the documents spread out before him, the silence of the library pressing in on him. The newsletters were filled with extremist rhetoric disguised as academic discourse. Articles written by Finch and Thorne advocating for a return to colonial values, a rejection of modern liberalism, a restoration of the foundational principles of the nation. The language was dense, archaic, laced with references to historical texts and philosophical treatises. He found an article written by Finch titled "The Doctrine of Correction: Restoring Historical Discipline in a Decadent Age." It argued that modern society was corrupt, that the youth were defiant and undisciplined, and that the only solution was the restoration of historical disciplinary methods to break the defiant spirit and enforce obedience. It spoke of the necessity of pain, of humiliation, of the purification of the soul through the mortification of the flesh. The language was chillingly familiar. It echoed the words Finch had used with Ilara, the threat of correction, the condemnation of modern defiance. It was a manifesto of control, of oppression, disguised as a moral crusade. He found another article written by Thorne detailing the necessity of re-education for those who challenged the established order. He spoke of the moral obligation to enforce societal norms, to punish those who deviated from the path of righteousness. He argued that the modern legal system was flawed, corrupted by empathy, by the misguided belief in rehabilitation. True justice, he argued, required retribution, a return to the swift and severe punishments of the past. And then he found it, a detailed description of the Judas cradle, its historical use, its effectiveness in extracting confessions and enforcing obedience. It was presented not as a torture device, but as a legitimate tool for restorative discipline, a necessary corrective for a society that had lost its way. The clinical detachment of the description, the academic justification for the brutality, was more horrifying than any explicit confession of guilt. The realization hit him with full force. They weren't just historical enthusiasts. They were extremists, fanatics who believed they had the right to impose their twisted ideology on others, using torture and intimidation to enforce their will. They were zealots, driven by a sense of righteous purpose, convinced of their moral superiority. They had targeted Ilara because she embodied the modern defiance they despised. She had challenged Finch, questioned his authority, and in doing so, she had sealed her fate. She was a symbol of everything they hated, everything they sought to destroy. The cellar at Blackwood Manor wasn't just a torture chamber, it was a disciplinary chamber, a place where the society brought those they deemed in need of correction. A place where they sought to break the human spirit, to reshape it in their own image. Kaelin felt a growing sense of dread. If Ilara wasn't the only one, if the society had been active for years, then there might be other victims, other families living in the shadow of uncertainty. Their loved ones vanished without a trace. The scope of the conspiracy was widening, the darkness deepening. He copied the documents, the evidence mounting, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. He now understood the motive, the ideology that fueled the conspiracy. But he also understood the danger. These were men who believed their actions were justified, righteous. They wouldn't hesitate to protect their secrets, to silence anyone who threatened to expose them. He left the library with a heavy heart, the fragile documents feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. The hunt was no longer just about justice for Alara. It was about exposing a darkness that had festered beneath the surface of the community for decades, hidden in plain sight, protected by power and influence. He was fighting not just for the past, but for the future. Armed with the knowledge of the society's ideology, Calen turned his attention to Alistair Finch. Thorne was too insulated, too powerful to approach directly. He was the judge, the embodiment of the law, protected by the very system Calen was fighting against. But Finch, the chief historian, the man who had confronted Alara, the architect of the doctrine of correction, was the key. He was the weak point, the vulnerability in the armor of the conspiracy. He tracked Finch down to a secluded, austere stone house on the outskirts of town. Finch maintained a low profile, working as a historical consultant, his connection to the society buried deep in the past, his reputation untarnished by the rumors that circulated among the local historians. Calen drove to the house, the gravel crunching under his tires, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the silence of the surrounding woods. The house was imposing, forbidding, a reflection of the man who lived inside. It was built in the colonial style, the dark stone walls, the narrow windows, the heavy oak door, creating an atmosphere of austerity, of historical authenticity. He parked in the driveway and walked to the front door, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on him. Before he could knock, the door opened. Alistair Finch stood in the doorway, his tall, slender frame silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He was in his 50s, with a severe intellectual face and cold, judgmental eyes. The same eyes Mariah had described, the same eyes that had looked upon Alara with contempt, with hatred. "Mr. Shaw," Finch greeted him, his voice smooth and cultured, a faint smile touching his lips. "I've been expecting you." Calen was taken aback. He hadn't told anyone he was coming here. He hadn't told Hanlon, hadn't told his parents. How did he know? "How did you know who I am?" Calen asked, his voice tense, the realization that he was being watched, monitored, sending a chill down his spine. "I make it my business to know who is investigating the past," Finch replied, the smile widening slightly, a predatory expression, "especially when that investigation touches upon matters of historical significance. And you, Mr. Shaw, have been quite persistent in your inquiries." He stepped aside, inviting Calen inside. Calen hesitated, the sense of danger prickling his skin. He was walking into the lion's den, confronting the monster in his lair. But he needed answers. He needed to see the man behind the ideology, the face of the evil that had destroyed his sister. He stepped into the house. The interior was sparsely furnished, minimalist, museum-like. Historical artifacts were displayed on pedestals, ancient weapons mounted on the walls, the air thick with the smell of leather and pipe tobacco. The atmosphere was cold, sterile, devoid of warmth, of life. It was a shrine to the past, a rejection of the present. Finch led him into the study, a room lined with books, the walls covered with historical maps and documents. He sat behind a large oak desk, gesturing for Calen to take the seat opposite him. He steepled his fingers, regarding Calen with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "So, Mr. Shaw," Finch began, his voice dripping with intellectual arrogance, "what brings you to my humble abode? Come to discuss the finer points of colonial history?" "I want to talk about Alara," Calen said, cutting straight to the point, his voice raw with emotion. Finch raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. "Alara? A student I taught briefly, many years ago. A disruptive influence, if I recall correctly. Defiant, undisciplined." "She challenged you," Calen countered, his voice rising in anger. "She embarrassed you. And you told her she needed to be corrected." Finch chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that grated on Calen's nerves. "Did I? It sounds like something I might say. Modern youth are indeed in desperate need of correction. They lack respect for authority, for tradition, for the foundational principles of our society. "I know about the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society," Calen pressed, watching Finch closely for any sign of fear, of guilt. "I know about Blackwood Manor. I know what you did there." Finch's smile faded, his expression hardening, his eyes blazing with a sudden intensity. "You know nothing, Mr. Shaw. You are dabbling in matters far beyond your comprehension. You are a child playing with fire." "I found her locket," Calen said, his voice trembling slightly, the memory of the discovery still vivid, painful. "In the cellar, hidden in the wall." A flicker of surprise crossed Finch's face, quickly masked by a veil of indifference. "A trinket, meaningless. It proves nothing." "It proves she was there," Calen insisted, his voice rising in desperation. "It proves what you did to her." Finch leaned forward, his eyes burning with the fervor of a zealot. "What we did, Mr. Shaw, was necessary. We sought to restore order, discipline in a world consumed by chaos and defiance. We sought to correct the flaws of modern society, one individual at a time." He spoke with the conviction of a true believer, his voice rising with passion. "Society requires correction, Mr. Shaw. It requires the strong hand of authority to guide the weak, to punish the defiant. It is a historical imperative, a moral obligation." The confession, veiled in philosophical rhetoric, chilled Calen to the bone. He was in the presence of a monster, a man who believed his atrocities were justified by a twisted ideology, a man who felt no remorse, no guilt. "You tortured her," Calen whispered, the words heavy with grief and rage. "We attempted to re-educate her," Finch corrected, his voice cold, clinical. "To break her defiant spirit, to save her from herself, to restore her to a state of grace." He stood up, towering over Calen, his shadow stretching across the room. "You are playing a dangerous game, Mr. Shaw, digging into matters protected by powerful men, men who will not tolerate interference." The implication was clear. Judge Thorne, the protector, the enabler. "There will be consequences," Finch warned, his voice low and menacing. "For you and for your family. I suggest you let the past remain buried. Some wounds should never be reopened." Calen stood up, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to strike the man, to break his cold composure, to inflict a fraction of the pain he had inflicted on Alara. But he knew it would be futile. He needed to expose him, to bring his crimes to light. He turned and walked out of the house, the weight of Finch's threat pressing down on him. He was certain of Finch's involvement, his guilt, but he also realized he had alerted the enemy. The Fellowship was aware of the investigation, and they were mobilized to protect their secrets. The hunt had just become infinitely more dangerous. Finch's threat echoed in Calen's mind as he drove away from the austere stone house. The warning against his family rattled him more than any threat against himself. He had dragged them back into the nightmare, reopened the wounds that had never healed. He called his parents immediately, his voice tight with urgency, urging them to be cautious, to lock their doors, to report any suspicious activity. They were frightened, confused, the sudden intrusion of danger into their quiet lives, unsettling, terrifying. But they trusted him. They knew he wouldn't stop until he found the truth. He reported the unsettling encounter to Hanlon. The detective was alarmed, recognizing the escalation, the brazenness of the threat. "They're closing ranks, Calen. They know we're getting close. They are feeling the pressure." "We need to move faster," Calen insisted, the frustration mounting. "We need to get ahead of them." "We are moving as fast as we can," Hanlon replied, the exhaustion evident in his voice. "But we are fighting a ghost. An enemy with connections, with resources, with the power to manipulate the system." That night, the opposition became tangible. Kalen returned to his motel room, the neon sign buzzing overhead, casting a sickly green light across the parking lot. The motel was cheap, anonymous, a place where people came to hide, to disappear. He felt a sudden vulnerability, a sense of exposure. As he approached his truck, he saw the glint of moonlight on shattered glass. He stopped, his heart pounding. The driver's side window was smashed, the glass scattered across the pavement like diamonds. The tires were slashed, the rubber sagging against the asphalt. A clear message, a warning. He switched motels, paying cash, checking in under an assumed name. He drove around for hours, making sure he wasn't being followed, the paranoia creeping in, the feeling of being watched, hunted. But the sense of violation, of vulnerability, lingered. He constantly felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the feeling of eyes following his every move. He started noticing the same dark sedan in his rearview mirror during the day, lurking just far enough behind to be dismissed as coincidence, but always there. He took evasive routes, doubled back, but the sedan always reappeared. They were organized, disciplined, and they were closing in. He went to his parents' home the next day, the anxiety gnawing at him. He found the front door slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness gaping in the afternoon light. His heart leaped into his throat. He pushed the door open, calling out their names. Silence. He entered the house cautiously, his hand instinctively reaching for the utility knife he kept clipped to his belt. The living room was empty. He moved towards the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee. His parents were gone. Panic seized him. He searched the house, his movements frantic, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. He found them in the backyard, sitting on the patio, their expressions somber. "What happened?" Kalen demanded, the relief making him dizzy. "The door was open." "We must have left it unlocked," his mother said dismissively, but her eyes darted towards the house, a flicker of fear betraying her casual tone. Kalen went back inside, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. The house looked undisturbed, nothing obviously missing. But then he noticed it, the subtle displacement of objects, the slight shift in the atmosphere. The house had been tossed, not violently, but meticulously. He went to the attic, where his mother kept the boxes of Alara's belongings. The boxes he had been looking through earlier, searching for clues, for connections. They were gone. A cold dread washed over him. They hadn't stolen anything of value. They had taken the memories, the remnants of Alara's life. It was a violation, a psychological assault designed to break their spirit. The fellowship was active, organized, and they were sending a message. They were tightening the noose, applying pressure from the shadows. The invisible hand of Judge Thorne was reaching out, threatening to crush them under the weight of their grief. Kalen realized he was no longer just fighting for justice. He was fighting for survival. The realization that Thorne and Finch were actively working against him, using intimidation and psychological warfare to protect their secrets, galvanized Kalen's determination. He knew the official investigation was moving too slowly, hampered by Thorne's influence and the constraints of the legal system. Hanlon was doing his best, but he was fighting an uphill battle, his hands tied by the bureaucracy, the red tape, the invisible wall of power surrounding the judge. They needed a breakthrough, a weak link inside the organization, someone willing to talk, to betray the fellowship. He reviewed the list of former members of the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society, the names he had compiled from the archives. Thorne and Finch were the leaders, insulated by power and ideology. They were the zealots, the true believers, unlikely to crack under pressure. But what about the others? The followers, the foot soldiers, the ones who had joined the society, seeking power, influence, a sense of belonging, but perhaps lacked the ideological fervor, the ruthless commitment to the cause. He identified Thomas Verity, a younger member who seemed less influential, not part of the inner circle. Verity's name appeared on the periphery of the society's activities, listed as a junior member in the event programs, a footnote in the history of the organization. Kalen dug into Verity's background, searching for vulnerabilities, for leverage. He accessed public records, financial documents, legal filings. He found it. Verity had significant recent financial troubles, a failed business venture, a mountain of debt, a pending foreclosure on his house. He was desperate, vulnerable, the perfect target. Kalen tracked Verity to his workplace, a small accounting firm in a nondescript office park. The building was drab, utilitarian, a stark contrast to the opulence of Blackwood Manor. Kalen waited in the parking lot, the afternoon sun beating down on the asphalt, the heat shimmering in the distance. He watched as Verity emerged from the building, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his financial woes evident in his posture. He was a small man, nervous, with a receding hairline and eyes that darted around anxiously, as if expecting a blow. Kalen approached him, intercepting him before he reached his car. "Mr. Verity?" Verity turned, startled, his hand flying to his chest. "Yes? Can I help you?" "My name is Kalen Shaw. I want to talk to you about the Brandywine Historical Preservation Society." Verity froze, his expression shifting from surprise to fear. He glanced around the parking lot as if expecting to see someone watching them, the paranoia evident in his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about. I have nothing to say." "I know you were a member," Kalen pressed, keeping his voice low, confidential. "I know about Blackwood Manor, about the cellar, about what happened there." Verity paled, his hands trembling. He fumbled with his car keys, trying to unlock the door, his movements frantic, desperate. "You need to leave. I can't talk to you. They will ruin me." "We found her locket," Kalen said, pulling the photograph of the cellar from his pocket. He showed it to Verity, the image of the Judas cradle and the bicycle hanging in the air between them. Laura Shaw. She was 15. They tortured her. They killed her. Verity stared at the photo, his eyes wide with terror, his breath catching in his throat. "I didn't know," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I didn't know what they were doing. I was just a junior member. I wasn't part of the inner circle." "You were there," Kalen insisted, his voice hardening. "You were part of it. You knew the ideology, the doctrine of correction." "I was young," Verity pleaded, his voice cracking, the tears welling in his eyes. "I was indoctrinated. Thorne and Finch, they were powerful men. They promised us a purpose, a sense of belonging. They promised us a return to the foundational values of the past." "And they delivered a nightmare," Kalen countered, his voice cold, relentless. "I left," Verity insisted, the desperation rising in his voice. "Years ago, when they started talking about correction, when I realized what it really meant. I didn't want any part of it." "But you knew," Kalen pressed. "You knew what they were capable of. And you said nothing. You let them get away with it." Verity hung his head, the shame overwhelming him, the weight of his complicity crushing him. "I was scared. They threatened me. They said they would destroy my life. They said they would come after my family." "They already have destroyed your life," Kalen pointed out, gesturing towards the office building, the symbol of Verity's failed dreams. "Your business failed. Your house is being foreclosed. They took everything from you, and you're still protecting them. Why?" Kalen applied pressure, the words coming easily now, fueled by his anger and desperation. "They're going to let you fall, Thomas. They're going to blame you for everything. The crimes at Blackwood Manor, the missing girl. They'll walk free, and you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. They will sacrifice you to save themselves. You are the weak link, and they know it." Verity looked up, his eyes filled with tears, the realization dawning on him. He was trapped, cornered, with no way out. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, the surrender in his voice palpable. "I want the truth," Kalen said, his voice softening slightly. "I want to know what happened to my sister. I want justice." Verity hesitated, the internal struggle evident on his face. The fear of retribution warred with the desire for redemption. He looked at Kalen, seeing the reflection of his own desperation in the young man's eyes. They called it the Historical Correction Fellowship, Verity whispered, the confession tearing him apart, the words heavy with shame. And they documented everything. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The Historical Correction Fellowship. The name formalized the ideology, giving shape to the amorphous dread that had been haunting Kalin for weeks. It was no longer a historical society. It was a cult, a secret organization dedicated to the violent enforcement of their twisted ideology. Verity cracked under the pressure, the years of suppressed guilt pouring out in a torrent of words. He sat in Kalin's truck, the cramped space feeling like a confessional booth, his hands trembling, his voice barely above a whisper. He was terrified, but the relief of unburdening himself, of finally speaking the truth, was palpable. The cellar was their disciplinary chamber, Verity explained, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. A place where they administered correction to those who defied their ideology. They called it re-education, a return to the foundational principles. Ilara, Kalin pressed, his voice tight with emotion. Why did they target her? What did she do? She challenged Finch, Verity confirmed, the memory still vivid in his mind. Publicly humiliated him. She questioned his authority, his interpretation of history. They saw her as a symbol of modern defiance, a cancer that needed to be excised. They decided to make an example of her. Kalin felt a surge of rage, the image of Ilara being targeted for her intelligence, her outspokenness, unbearable. She had died because she dared to speak her mind. The bike? Kalin asked, the image of the dusty bicycle mounted on the wall still haunting him. Why did they keep it? A mockery, Verity replied, his voice filled with self-loathing. A symbol of her worldly freedom that they believed led to her corruption. They mounted it on the wall as a reminder of their victory over the modern world, a trophy of their success. Kalin's blood ran cold. The calculated cruelty, the ideological justification for the torture, was almost beyond comprehension. They weren't just monsters, they were meticulous monsters. How did they take her? Kalin asked, his voice tight, the question tearing him apart. They staged a roadside encounter, Verity explained, the details spilling out of him. Pretended their car had broken down. She stopped to help. She was always helpful, always kind. They abducted her. It was quick, efficient. They had done it before. The revelation that Ilara wasn't the only victim hit Kalin like a physical blow. The scope of the conspiracy was widening, the horror deepening. There were others, other families living with the agonizing uncertainty, the paralyzing grief. You said they documented everything, Kalin pressed, his mind racing, the implications of the revelation staggering. What do you mean? They are historians, Verity stressed, the irony lost on him. They believed their work was righteous, necessary. They recorded the re-education sessions as proof of their success, a historical record of their achievements, and as blackmail to ensure loyalty among the members, to ensure silence. Recorded how? Kalin asked, his heart pounding, the anticipation building in his chest. VHS tapes, Verity replied, and journals. Meticulous records of every session, every correction, dates, names, methodologies, outcomes, everything. The archives, the proof Kalin had been searching for, concrete evidence that would connect Thorne and Finch to the crimes at Blackwood Manor, irrefutable proof that would bring the fellowship down. Where are they? Kalin demanded, his voice urgent, desperate. Where are the archives? When the fellowship disbanded in 1995, when they sold Blackwood Manor, the archives were moved, Verity explained. They were too incriminating to be left behind. I don't know the exact location, but I know who does. Thorne, Kalin stated, the name a curse on his lips. He's the keeper of the records, Verity confirmed, the guardian of their secrets. He controls everything. Verity warned Kalin, his voice urgent, the fear returning to his eyes. Since the discovery at the manor, Thorne has been mobilizing. He's terrified. He's been contacting the former members, securing the archives. Kalen realized what that meant. Securing the archives meant destroying them. The window of opportunity was closing rapidly. They had hours, maybe days, before the evidence was gone forever. The truth, the justice for Alara, was slipping away. Kalen left Verity in the parking lot, the man's confession echoing in his ears. He had the truth, the motive, the method, but he still needed the proof. And the proof was in the hands of a man who had the power to destroy it. The race against time had begun. He had to find the archives before they vanished into the flames of history. Kalen knew they were running out of time. If Thorne was mobilizing to destroy the archives, every passing hour brought them closer to losing the evidence forever. He relayed the information to Hanlon, the urgency in his voice overriding the exhaustion that was beginning to seep into his bones. VHS tapes and journals, Hanlon repeated, the significance of the discovery dawning on him, the excitement in his voice palpable. If they exist, they change everything. We can finally connect Thorne and Finch to Alara. We can bring them down. Verity says Thorne is the keeper of the records, Kalen explained, the frustration mounting, and he's moving to secure them. We have to move now. We need a warrant, Hanlon stated, already reaching for the phone, the bureaucratic hurdles looming before them. But getting a warrant for a sitting judge based on the testimony of an informant who refuses to go on record, it's virtually impossible. The system is designed to protect them, to insulate them from scrutiny. Verity is terrified, Kalen insisted, his voice rising in anger. He won't testify against Thorne. Not unless we have the proof. He knows what they are capable of. Then we're stuck in a catch-22, Hanlon realized, the frustration evident in the tightness of his jaw. We need the proof to get the warrant, but we need the warrant to get the proof. We are running out of options. Not if we find the archives first, Kalen said, a desperate plan forming in his mind. We need to track Thorne's movements, find out where he's hiding the records. We need to get ahead of him. Kalen began intensive surveillance of Judge Thorne. He parked his truck outside the courthouse, the imposing structure a symbol of the power he was fighting against. He watched as Thorne emerged from the building, his black robes billowing behind him like the wings of a raven. Thorne moved with an air of untouchable authority, the deference of the people around him palpable. He was the law, the order, the embodiment of justice. The irony was sickening. Kalen followed him, maintaining a safe distance, blending into the traffic, his old truck a stark contrast to the sleek luxury cars that populated Thorne's world. He observed Thorne making several discreet meetings, brief encounters in parking lots and secluded cafes, the conversations hushed, the body language tense. One of the meetings was with Alistair Finch. They met in a park, the autumn leaves swirling around them, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun. They spoke for several minutes, their conversation intense, their expressions grim. Kalen watched from a distance, the frustration gnawing at him. They were coordinating, planning the destruction of the evidence. They were closing the net. He needed to identify the location of the archives. He utilized his knowledge of historical property records, the skills he had honed over years of restoration work. He spent hours at the county records office, digging through the archives, researching properties owned by Thorne or connected trusts, searching for secluded locations, places where the archives could be stored discreetly, hidden from the prying eyes of the world. He identified two potential locations: a remote hunting lodge in the mountains, owned by Thorne's family for generations, a place of seclusion and privilege, and a decommissioned historical warehouse in an industrial part of the county, owned by a shell corporation linked to Thorne, a ghost building in a forgotten part of the city. The hunting lodge was a possibility, but it was difficult to access and monitor. The warehouse, however, was more promising. It was isolated, secure, and large enough to store extensive archives. And it had a historical designation, a perfect cover for the activities of the fellowship. Kalen drove to the industrial park, the landscape dominated by rusting factories and abandoned warehouses, the air thick with the smell of decay and neglect. He located the building, a massive brick structure with boarded-up windows and a faded sign that read, Brandywine Antiquities. The connection to the Preservation Society was undeniable. This had to be it. The name itself was a mockery, a disguise for the horrors hidden within. He parked his truck behind an abandoned dumpster, the smell of decay filling the air. He settled in for a long night of surveillance, the anticipation twisting a knot in his stomach. He was close. He could feel it. The answers were inside that warehouse, the proof, the justice for Ilara. And he was willing to do whatever it took to get them. The waiting game had begun. The warehouse loomed before Kalen, a monolithic structure silhouetted against the darkening sky. It seemed abandoned, forgotten, a relic of a bygone industrial era, the brick walls crumbling, the windows shattered or boarded up. He watched from the shadows, the hours ticking by, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of a passing train, the scurrying of rats in the debris. The industrial park was a graveyard of forgotten dreams, a place where the past was left to rot. Late that evening, a vehicle arrived. A dark sedan, the same one he had seen in his rearview mirror days earlier, the one that had been tailing him, watching him. It parked near the entrance, the headlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating the faded sign of Brandywine Antiquities. Alistair Finch got out, his severe features illuminated by the dashboard light. He looked around, scanning the area, his movements cautious, deliberate. He entered the warehouse through a side door, the metal screeching softly as he forced it open. Minutes later, another vehicle arrived. A luxury car, sleek and expensive, out of place in the desolate landscape. Judge Roman Thorne emerged, his imposing figure recognizable even in the darkness. He walked with an air of authority, of ownership, as if he belonged here, in this place of decay and neglect. He followed Finch into the warehouse, the door closing behind him with a metallic clang. Kalen's heart leapt into his throat. This was it. They were here. The convergence of the two leaders of the Fellowship at this secluded location could only mean one thing. They were moving or destroying the archives. Tonight. He called Hanlon, his voice urgent, the adrenaline surging through his veins. They're here. Thorne and Finch. At the warehouse, Brandywine Antiquities. Are you sure? Hanlon demanded, the excitement evident in his voice. You have visual confirmation? I saw them go inside, Kalen insisted. They are here. Now. I'm scrambling a team, Hanlon said, the sound of shouting voices in the background, the mobilization of the forces of justice. But it will take time. We have to do this by the book. We need a warrant. We can't afford any mistakes, not with a sitting judge. We don't have time, Kalen argued, the panic rising in his throat. They're destroying the evidence. I know it. How do you know? Hanlon pressed. Kalen scanned the building, searching for any sign of activity. And then he saw it. A thin plume of smoke rising from a ventilation pipe on the roof, curling into the night sky, the faint glow of fire visible through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. They're burning it, Kalen whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. They're already burning the archives. Panic seized him. The proof, the evidence, the answers he had been searching for were going up in smoke. The history of their crimes, the documentation of their horrors, turning to ash. He couldn't wait for Hanlon. He couldn't let them destroy Ilara's story. He couldn't let them erase the past. He hung up the phone, the decision made. He had to go in. Alone. He approached the warehouse, his movements quick and decisive. The main doors were sealed, chained shut. The side door was locked from the inside. He circled the building, searching for a way in, the smell of burning paper growing stronger, more pungent, the crackle of flames audible from within. He found a fire escape, the metal rusted and unstable, the ladder hanging precariously from the side of the building. He tested his weight, the structure groaning under the strain. He started climbing, his hands gripping the cold metal, his heart pounding against his ribs. He reached the second floor, the window boarded up. He used the pry bar from his truck to force the boards open, the screech of metal echoing in the quiet night, the sound swallowed by the roar of the fire inside. He climbed through the window, landing on a dusty wooden floor. The air inside was thick with smoke, the smell of burning plastic and paper overwhelming. The heat was intense, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. He moved towards the center of the building, the sound of a roaring fire drawing him closer, the glow of the inferno illuminating the cavernous space. He was inside the belly of the beast, and he was running out of time. The interior of the warehouse was a cavernous space filled with the debris of forgotten lives. Stacks of old furniture, crates of antiques, relics of the past covered in dust and cobwebs, the remnants of Brandywine antiquities. But Kalen ignored the surroundings, his focus entirely on the source of the smoke, the heart of the inferno. He moved through the shadows, his footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor, the air growing hotter, thicker with every step. He reached a metal catwalk overlooking the main floor, the heat from the fire below washing over him, the smoke stinging his eyes, burning his lungs. He looked down, the scene unfolding below him like a nightmare. A large industrial incinerator roared in the center of the room, the flames leaping towards the ceiling, the heat intense, suffocating. Thorne and Finch stood before it, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, their figures silhouetted against the inferno. They were systematically feeding boxes of files and VHS tapes into the flames, their movements methodical, deliberate, a ritualistic destruction of the past. Dozens of boxes remained, stacked against the wall, a library of horrors waiting to be consumed by the flames. But they were working quickly, efficiently, their determination fueled by the desperate need to protect their secrets, to erase their crimes. Kalen watched, paralyzed by a mixture of horror and desperation. The evidence of their crimes, the proof of Alara's fate, was being destroyed before his eyes. The history of the Fellowship, the documentation of their atrocities, turning to ash. He had to stop them. He descended the catwalk ladder quietly, his movements slow and controlled, his eyes fixed on the two men below. He landed on the main floor, the heat from the incinerator pressing against him, the roar of the flames deafening. He moved through the shadows, using the stacks of crates and furniture as cover, edging closer to the remaining archives. The air was thick with the smell of burning plastic, the acrid smoke choking him. He could hear the crackling of the flames, the roar of the incinerator consuming the tapes, the plastic melting and warping in the intense heat. The sound was mesmerizing, hypnotic, a soundtrack to the destruction of memory. He reached the stack of boxes, his hands trembling. He needed proof, something tangible, undeniable. He opened a box near him, the cardboard brittle with age. Inside were leather-bound journals, the pages filled with meticulous handwriting, detailing dates, names, correction sessions. He grabbed a journal, the heavy leather cover cold against his fingers. He frantically searched for Alara's name, the pages blurring in the flickering light, the smoke making his eyes water. He found it. A file dedicated to her, containing horrifying details of her abduction, her re-education, the systematic use of the Judas cradle to break her will. The clinical detachment of the language, the ideological justification for the torture, chilled him to the bone. It was a record of industrialized cruelty, a testament to the depths of human depravity. They hadn't just killed her. They had documented her destruction, analyzed her suffering, celebrated her submission. He spotted a box of VHS tapes near the incinerator, prioritized for destruction. He saw one labeled E. Shaw, Correction, 1988. This was it, the visual proof, the undeniable evidence that would expose the monsters who had taken his sister, the recording of her suffering, the documentation of their crimes. He moved to grab it, his focus entirely on the tape. But in his haste, his foot struck a metal pipe lying on the floor. The clang echoed in the cavernous space, cutting through the roar of the incinerator, a sharp metallic sound that shattered the silence. Finch turned, his eyes widening as he saw Kalen emerging from the shadows. He yelled a warning to Thorne, the sound swallowed by the roar of the flames. The infiltration was over. The confrontation had begun. Kalen lunged for the box of tapes, the adrenaline surging through him, the instinct to save the evidence, overriding the fear that paralyzed him moments before. Finch intercepted him, tackling him hard, his body slamming into Kalen with a brutal force. They crashed into a stack of boxes, the impact sending files and tapes scattering across the floor, the accumulated dust rising in a suffocating cloud. A violent, desperate struggle ensued. Finch was strong, driven by the need to protect the Fellowship's secrets, his ideological fervor lending him a manic energy. He fought with a cold, calculated brutality, his hands grappling for Kalen's throat, his fingers digging into his windpipe. He was fighting for his legacy, for his freedom, for the ideology that defined his life. Kalen fought back, fueled by the rage and grief that had been simmering beneath the surface for 14 years. He was fighting for Alara, for the truth, for the justice that had been denied them for so long. He was fighting for the ghosts of the victims, for the silenced voices crying out from the archives. Thorne ignored the fight, his focus entirely on the destruction of the evidence. He accelerated the burning, grabbing handfuls of tapes and throwing them into the incinerator, the flames consuming the plastic casings, the images melting into oblivion. He was erasing the past, rewriting history, protecting his power, his reputation. Kalen watched, the sight of the evidence vanishing fueling his desperation. He grabbed a heavy ledger from the floor, the leather-bound book solid in his hands. He slammed it into Finch's face, the impact staggering the man, the sound of the blow sickening. Finch stumbled backward, blood pouring from his nose, his eyes blazing with hatred. Kalen scrambled towards the incinerator, confronting Thorne. The judge turned, his face contorted in a mask of rage and frustration. The exposure of his life's work, the destruction of his legacy, was unfolding before him. He was no longer the respected judge, the pillar of the community. He was a cornered animal, desperate, dangerous. "You!" Thorne roared, his voice filled with contempt, the mask of civility slipping away, revealing the monster beneath. "You dare to interfere with our work? You dare to challenge the natural order?" He grabbed a heavy metal pipe, the same one Kalen had tripped over moments earlier, and swung it viciously at Kalen's head. Kalen ducked, the pipe whistling past his ear and smashing into the side of the incinerator, the impact sending sparks flying into the air, the metallic clang echoing in the warehouse. Kalen tackled Thorne, the momentum carrying them towards the edge of the flames. They struggled at the brink of the inferno, the heat scorching their skin, the smoke filling their lungs. The air was thick with the smell of burning plastic and the stench of their own sweat. Thorne was older but powerful, his rage giving him a terrifying strength. He pushed Kalen towards the flames, the heat searing Kalen's back, the orange glow reflecting in the judge's eyes. Kalen fought back, his hands grappling for leverage, his fingers digging into Thorne's arms. He managed to grab the E. Shaw tape, the plastic casing slick with sweat and dust. He clutched it tightly, the physical proof of Alara's fate finally in his hands. He grabbed a handful of other tapes from the open box, stuffing them into his jacket, the weight heavy against his ribs. Thorne roared in frustration, his fingers digging into Kalen's throat, the pressure building, the air escaping his lungs. Kalen gasped for air, the edges of his vision blurring, the darkness closing in. He was losing consciousness. He had the tape, but he had to get out. He had to escape. He had to survive. Kalen's lungs burned, the lack of oxygen making him dizzy, the world tilting precariously around him. Thorne's grip tightened, his thumbs pressing against Kalen's windpipe, the judge's face a mask of rage, illuminated by the flickering firelight. Desperation fueled a final surge of adrenaline. Kalen brought his knee up sharply, connecting with Thorne's groin. The judge grunted in pain, his grip loosening slightly, the surprise of the blow staggering him. Kalen twisted free, gasping for air, the sudden influx of oxygen making his head spin. He stumbled backward, the tape clutched tightly in his hand, the plastic casing digging into his palm. Thorne recovered quickly, his eyes blazing with hatred, the pain fueling his anger. He advanced on Kalen, the metal pipe raised menacingly, his intent clear. He was going to kill him. Finch was recovering, wiping the blood from his face, his expression murderous. He moved to block the exit, cutting off Kalen's escape route. Kalen was trapped, cornered between the incinerator and the two men who had destroyed his family. The realization hit him with a chilling clarity. He might not make it out of here alive. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to breathe, the visibility reduced to a few feet. The fire was spreading, the flames licking at the stacks of boxes, the dry paper igniting instantly, the archives turning to ash. The warehouse was becoming an inferno. Kalen looked around frantically, searching for an escape route. The side door was blocked by Finch. The main doors were sealed. The fire escape was on the other side of the warehouse, inaccessible through the flames. He saw his opening. The catwalk above, the ladder he had descended earlier. If he could reach it, he could climb to the second floor and escape through the window he had entered. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But it was his only chance. He threw the heavy journal he still held at Thorne's face, the impact distracting the judge for a moment, the heavy book hitting him in the chest. Kalen sprinted towards the ladder, his legs burning with exertion, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Finch intercepted him, grabbing his arm, pulling him back, his grip like iron. Kalen swung the tape at Finch's head, the plastic casing connecting with his temple with a sickening crack. Finch staggered, releasing his grip, his eyes rolling back in his head. He collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Kalen reached the ladder, scrambling up the metal rungs, the heat from the fire below searing his back. Thorne was right behind him, grabbing his ankle, pulling him down, his grip desperate, tenacious. Kalen kicked out, his boot connecting with Thorne's face, the impact sending a jolt of pain through his leg. The judge fell backward, landing heavily on the concrete floor, the metal pipe clattering beside him. Kalen reached the catwalk, the metal vibrating under his feet, the heat rising from the inferno below. He sprinted towards the window, the smoke swirling around him, the roar of the fire deafening. He reached the window, the cold night air rushing in through the opening, a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. He looked back, the scene below him, a vision of hell. The fire had spread throughout the warehouse, the archives consumed by the flames, the history of the fellowship turning to ash. Thorne and Finch were silhouettes against the inferno, their figures distorted by the smoke and heat, their reign of terror finally coming to an end. He climbed through the window, landing on the fire escape, the metal cold beneath his hands. He scrambled down the ladder, his hands slipping on the rusted metal, the sound of his ragged breathing loud in the sudden silence of the night. He reached the ground, the cold air hitting his lungs like a shock. He ran towards his truck, the tape clutched tightly in his hand, the sound of the roaring fire echoing behind him. He didn't look back. He had the proof. He had the truth. And he was alive. Kalen sped away from the warehouse, the tires of his truck spitting gravel as he accelerated onto the main road. He didn't stop until the glow of the fire was a distant flicker in his rearview mirror, the smoke billowing into the night sky, a funeral pyre for the secrets of the fellowship. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hands shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a throbbing pain in his shoulder. He looked at the tape lying on the passenger seat. E. Shaw, correction, 1988. The physical proof of Alara's fate, the culmination of weeks of investigation, of sleepless nights and agonizing discoveries. The weight of the tape felt immense, a tangible connection to the sister he had lost, a testament to her suffering. He drove straight to the state police barracks, the tape burning a hole in his consciousness. He burst into the station, his clothes stained with soot and blood, his eyes wild with a mixture of triumph and horror. The atmosphere in the barracks was chaotic, the mobilization of the tactical teams creating a frenzy of activity. He found Detective Hanlon in the command center, coordinating the raid on the warehouse. Hanlon turned, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he took in Kalen's appearance. "Kalen? What happened?" "We were just heading to the warehouse. We saw the smoke." Kalen walked over to Hanlon's desk and placed the tape on the surface between them, the plastic casing smeared with dust and grime. "They were burning it. The archives. I got this." Hanlon picked up the tape, his eyes widening as he read the label. He recognized the gravity of the discovery, the weight of the evidence in his hands. He looked at Kalen, a mixture of admiration and disbelief in his eyes. "You went in alone?" Hanlon asked, the realization dawning on him. "Kalen, that was reckless. You could have been killed, Thorne and Finch." "I had no choice," Kalen replied, his voice raw, the exhaustion creeping into his tone. "They were destroying everything. They were erasing her." Hanlon nodded, the unspoken understanding passing between them. He knew Kalen had done what he couldn't, what the system couldn't. He had broken the rules to find the truth. He led Kalen to an interrogation room, the sterile environment a stark contrast to the chaos of the warehouse. The room was small, the walls bare, the silence heavy. "We need to see what's on this," Hanlon said, already reaching for the phone. "We need a VCR." They located a VCR in the evidence room, the antiquated technology suddenly the key to unlocking the secrets of the past. They connected it to a small television monitor, the screen flickering to life with a burst of static. Hanlon inserted the tape, the machine whirring as it engaged the magnetic strip. Kalen watched, his heart pounding, the anticipation twisting a knot in his stomach. He insisted on watching. He needed to see it. He needed to know the truth, however horrific it might be. He needed to bear witness to Alara's suffering. The grainy footage began. The image resolved into a familiar scene. The Blackwood wine cellar, the stone walls, the arched ceiling, the racks of dusty bottles. The Judas cradle standing in the center of the room, the ropes and harness hanging ominously from the ceiling. Members of the fellowship were present, their faces obscured by the shadows, their figures moving with a chilling deliberation. Kalen recognized Thorne and Finch, their younger selves recognizable despite the passage of time, their expressions cold, clinical, devoid of empathy. And then he saw her. Alara. She was terrified, her eyes wide with fear, her body trembling. But she was also defiant, her chin raised, her gaze unwavering as she confronted her captors. She was wearing the school uniform, the blue jacket, the polka-dot skirt, the image from the photograph brought to life. Corrupted, destroyed. The sight broke Kalen. The image of his sister, vibrant and full of life, reduced to this terrified victim in this chamber of horrors. The tears streamed down his face, the grief overwhelming him. The footage documented the re-education session, the prolonged stress positions, the psychological torture designed to break her will, the clinical detachment of her captors as they administered the correction, their voices muffled, distorted, but the tone unmistakable, authoritative, judgmental, righteous. The tape confirmed the fellowship's motive. They targeted her for her defiance, for her refusal to conform to their twisted ideology. They sought to break her spirit, to crush the very essence of who she was. The tape ended abruptly, the screen dissolving into static. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint whirring of the VCR and the sound of Kalen's ragged breathing. Kalen stared at the blank screen, the images burned into his memory. The truth was more horrific than he could have imagined, but it was also the key to justice. The evidence was undeniable. The monsters who had taken his sister were finally exposed. The silence had been broken. The silence that followed the tape's abrupt end was heavier than the air in the cellar. Kalen stared at the static on the screen, the grainy images of Alara's terror and defiance seared into his retinas. He felt hollowed out, the confirmation of his worst fears leaving him numb, the reality of her suffering a gaping wound in his soul. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave of pain that threatened to drown him. Hanlon was the first to speak, his voice rough with emotion, the professionalism cracking, revealing the human beneath the badge. My God. He ejected the tape, the plastic casing feeling suddenly fragile in his hands, a repository of horrors. This was it, the undeniable proof that connected Thorne and Finch to Ilara's disappearance, to the atrocities committed at Blackwood Manor. The evidence that would bring down the Fellowship. "We have them," Hanlon said, the realization dawning on him, the weight of the discovery settling on his shoulders. "We finally have them." He mobilized the tactical teams, the urgency in his voice electrifying the atmosphere in the station. The bureaucratic wall that had protected Thorne and Finch for so long crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The power dynamic had shifted. The hunters had become the hunted. Kalen sat in the interrogation room, the events of the night catching up with him, the exhaustion, the pain, the emotional toll of the discovery. He closed his eyes, the image of Ilara's terrified face haunting him. He had found the truth, but it offered little comfort. The reality of her suffering was a wound that would never heal. The closure he sought felt distant, elusive. Hanlon returned, his expression grim, the weight of the task ahead evident in the lines around his eyes. "We're raiding the warehouse, and we're picking up Thorne and Finch." "They were still inside when I left," Kalen said, his voice hollow, the memory of the inferno still vivid. The fire was spreading. They might be trapped? "We'll handle it," Hanlon assured him, his voice firm, determined. "You did good, Kalen. You broke the case. You brought her home." Kalen nodded, the praise feeling meaningless in the face of the overwhelming grief. He had broken the case, but he couldn't fix what was broken in his family, in himself. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Kalen was treated by paramedics, his burns and bruises catalogued, his statement taken. He recounted the events of the night, the infiltration, the struggle, the escape. He spoke of the archives, the journals, the tapes, the meticulous documentation of the Fellowship's crimes. Hanlon returned late that night, the exhaustion etched on his face, the smell of smoke clinging to his clothes. "We got 'em. Thorne and Finch. They were arrested at the warehouse, trying to control the fire and salvage what they could. They didn't resist. They knew it was over." "The archives?" Kalen asked, the hope flickering in his chest, the fear that the evidence had been lost still lingering. "Damaged," Hanlon replied, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "But we managed to seize the remaining boxes. The journals, the files. It's all there, enough to bury them." The scope of the Historical Correction Fellowship began to emerge. The archives revealed a history of industrialized cruelty spanning decades. Multiple other victims, names listed in the journals, their fates detailed in the clinical language of the Fellowship. Young men and women vanished without a trace, their disappearances dismissed as runaways, their families left to grieve in silence. The investigation expanded nationwide as the dispersed members listed in the archives were tracked down and arrested. The conspiracy that had seemed so localized, so contained, was revealed to be a sprawling network of extremists hiding in plain sight, embedded in the fabric of society, protected by power and influence. The revelation on the tape was the key that unlocked the floodgates. The undeniable evidence of their crimes, the visual proof of their cruelty, shattered the facade of respectability that had protected them for so long. The monsters were finally dragged into the light, their secrets exposed, their legacy destroyed. The silence had been broken. The truth had prevailed. The weight of the evidence was insurmountable. Detective Miles Hanlon watched as the tactical teams descended on the warehouse, the flashing lights cutting through the smoke-filled night, the sirens echoing in the industrial landscape. The fire department arrived shortly after, battling the blaze that threatened to consume the remaining evidence, the water streaming down the brick facade, turning the dust and grime into a thick black sludge. Thorne and Finch were arrested on site, their faces stained with soot, their expressions a mixture of defiance and disbelief. The aura of untouchable authority that had surrounded the judge crumbled as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the metal cold against his skin. He was no longer the embodiment of the law, he was a criminal, exposed, vulnerable. The remaining archives, though damaged by the fire and water, were seized. A team of forensic accountants and historians were brought in to analyze the documents, the scope of the fellowship's activities slowly coming into focus. The journals detailed decades of abuse, a systematic campaign of terror waged against those who defied their extremist ideology. The victims were diverse, ranging from outspoken activists to rebellious teenagers, their only crime a refusal to conform, a defiance of the established order. The investigation expanded rapidly, the localized missing person case transforming into a nationwide manhunt for the dispersed members of the fellowship. Arrests were made across the country, the network of extremists dismantled piece by piece, the tentacles of the conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of power. Under intense interrogation, Alistair Finch, faced with the video evidence and Thorne's loss of power, confessed the full scope of the operation. The ideological fervor that had fueled his actions crumbled under the weight of the impending consequences, the facade of the intellectual historian giving way to the reality of the sadistic torturer. He detailed the history of the fellowship, the recruitment methods, the indoctrination process, the meticulous documentation of their crimes. And he revealed the final agonizing truth about Alara's fate. "She broke," Finch admitted, his voice hollow, devoid of emotion, the clinical detachment chilling. The correction was successful. Her will was broken. She became compliant, obedient. She accepted the doctrine. "And then what?" Hanlon pressed, his voice tight with controlled rage, the image of the defiant girl on the tape flashing in his mind. "She served her purpose," Finch replied, the words hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. "She was disposed of." The correction was complete. He gave up the location where the victims were buried, a remote corner of the Blackwood Manor estate, hidden beneath a grove of ancient trees, the ground undisturbed for years. The FBI excavated the burial site, the grim task unfolding over several days. Kalin insisted on being present, a silent witness to the final chapter of Alara's story. He stood at the edge of the excavation site, the smell of freshly turned earth filling the air, the silence broken only by the sound of the shovels digging into the soil. Alara's remains were recovered, along with the remains of several other victims. The forensic analysis confirmed their identities, the agonizing uncertainty of their fates finally replaced by the painful closure of the truth. They were home. The wider scope of the fellowship's crimes sent shockwaves through the community. The revelation that a respected judge and a group of historical preservationists had been operating a torture chamber beneath Blackwood Manor shattered the illusion of safety and security, the trust in the institutions designed to protect them. The trials began in the spring of 2003. The evidence presented was overwhelming. The VHS tape of Alara's correction was played in the courtroom, the grainy footage silencing the room, the horror of her suffering undeniable, the sound of her cries echoing in the hushed silence. Thorne and Finch were convicted of multiple counts of kidnapping, torture, and murder. They received life sentences, their reign of terror finally brought to an end. The justice that had been denied for so long was finally served. The monsters were caged. The aftermath of the trial brought a strange, unsettling quiet. The chaos and urgency that had consumed Kalin's life for months receded, leaving behind a profound sense of loss, a void that the justice system couldn't fill. The silence, once a source of comfort, now felt heavy, suffocating. He returned to his parents' home, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of the truth. The house felt empty, haunted by the ghosts of the past. He sat with them and shared the full extent of Alara's suffering, the agonizing details of her final days, the horrifying reality of her fate. It was a conversation that shattered them, the confirmation of their worst fears leaving them broken, their grief raw, exposed. But the agonizing uncertainty was finally gone. The silence that had haunted them for 14 years was replaced by the painful closure of the truth. They held a proper burial, the small ceremony attended by the friends and family who had never forgotten Alara. They laid her to rest beneath a towering oak tree, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting dancing shadows on the freshly turned earth. Kalen found himself unable to return to his previous life. The smell of aged plaster and turpentine, once a source of comfort, now evoked the memory of the cellar, the smell of decay and despair. He quit his job at the courthouse, the meticulous task of restoring the past feeling meaningless in the face of the horrors he had uncovered. He couldn't go back to the silence, the isolation of the dome. He needed to be grounded, connected to the world, to the living. He began working with the families of the other victims identified from the Fellowship's archives. He used his meticulous research skills, his understanding of historical records, his empathy for their suffering, to help them find answers, to bring closure to their own agonizing uncertainties. He became their advocate, their voice, their guide through the darkness. He found a difficult peace in this new purpose. He was honoring Alara's defiant spirit, the very essence of who she was, by exposing the monsters who tried to break it. He was giving voice to the silenced, bringing light to the darkness. He was fighting for the truth, for justice, for the memory of the victims. He often visited Alara's grave, the small headstone a physical reminder of the sister he had lost. He would sit there for hours, the silence broken only by the rustling of the leaves, the chirping of the birds. He would talk to her, telling her about his work, about the families he was helping, about the legacy she had left behind. The pain of her loss would never fade, the wound would never fully heal. But the agonizing uncertainty was gone. He knew the truth, and the truth, however horrific, had set him free. He was no longer defined by the tragedy of her disappearance, but by the strength of her spirit, a spirit that lived on in the fight for justice, in the refusal to be broken. He was the restorer, not of frescoes and cornices, but of memory, of truth, of the fragile threads that connect the past to the present.